Next, we will be discussing science-based targets for nature. I have in studio with me Erin Billman, Executive Director of the Science-Based Targets Network. And joining us via Zoom is Luis Amaray, the CEO of the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which is driving ambitious climate action in the private sector. Also via Zoom is Martha Stevenson, Senior Director of the Strategy and Research on the Forest Team at WWF US, leading conservation of the world's most important forests. So this is a fantastic panel to learn about science-based targets for nature. Erin, let me start with you. You're leading the charge on nature targets. What are you working on, and how does climate relate to nature?
So what I'm working on is science-based targets for nature for companies and cities. There are already climate science-based targets in existence. Luis here representing SBTI, and we're now expanding on that to cover nature broadly, which includes land, freshwater, oceans, and biodiversity. Essentially, you've heard about the need for system solutions, and we've tackled climate too much in silo in the past. And climate change is one of the leading causes of nature loss, but also nature is our biggest ally in the climate change battle, with nature absorbing over half of emissions. And so we're basically expanding on the approach that we've taken with climate science-based targets and broadening that to all the ways in which companies and cities impact and depend on the environment. And targets are science-based if they are, by definition, using the best available science, if they're measurable, and if they enable a company or a city to do their part to meet a global goal like the Paris Agreement.
Fantastic. Thank you for saying that so clearly. As we're trying to figure out the relationship with climate, nature, how to speak about science-based targets. So, Luis, let me come to you. SBTI is a leader in supporting companies to set ambitious climate targets in line with science. So what does the climate-nature connection evoke for you, as after what we just discussed and identified? And what advice would you pass on to SBTN as they start to issue nature targets?
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for the question. I must say I'm a little bit biased on the subject. I spent almost 20 years of my life working mostly on nature issues, supporting sustainable global food systems and eliminating deforestation from supply chains, and investing in towards better local rural livelihoods. So I lead this organization that is setting science-based targets for the climate, but I'm obviously biased towards nature. The key message is that, as Erin said, we will not achieve net zero carbon emissions without nature playing a stronger role, both within the agriculture and forest sector and through nature-based solutions, right? As Erin pointed out, it's part of the equation. Those things are interlinked. And if we're talking about net zero carbon emissions in the future, we need to bring nature into that discussion. If I had one piece of advice, and we're partners with Erin and we already discussed that, I think and she mentioned it a little bit, is what does not get measured does not get managed. We need strong nature accounting systems and measurable KPIs to advance, to promote the advancement of science-based targets for nature. For climate, it's relatively easy, as hard as it sounds, because we have a common measurable unit, right? Tons of carbon. It's global. It's applicable anywhere. For some of the nature aspects, sometimes that measurement is a little bit harder. So without measuring and setting those KPIs, that's the first step to setting science targets, right? You have to measure and know that what success looks like in quantifiable ways, because if that doesn't happen, then it becomes a storytelling competition. And the good news is that for nature, as Erin will be able to tell, there's a lot of things that has been done on that front as well, specifically when it comes to deforestation and reforestation, for example, which is easier to measure. For some other aspects, it will be a little bit harder, but measure in order to manage, so you can actually set targets that we can follow up on them. It's absolutely important.
Great, thank you for that. Martha, let me bring you into this, since you've worked on both SBTI and SBTN target development. Tell us about this new flag methodology for SBTI and the critical bridge you see building between the climate and nature agendas.
Great, thank you so much. It's so nice to be with all of you. So midsummer, we'll be issuing the flag targets, which is forest, land, and agriculture targets for companies to set targets on climate within those sectors. And this is critical because the forestry and agriculture sector right now contributes 22% to global emissions. And as Louise highlighted, it has the potential to contribute 30% to the climate mitigation solution through these nature-based solutions. The development of this methodology, it's filling this critical gap in the SBTI toolkit, as before today, the majority of companies have not been including these emissions and actions in their climate strategies. And so that's almost a quarter of global emissions that have not been addressed. So this is really exciting for that reason. And we estimate that when we look at everything that needs to happen in the land sector from a climate perspective, about 60% of that needed mitigation will come from companies in the food and forestry sectors. So activating here is critical. This includes activities like reducing emissions from deforestation, agricultural emissions, stopping food waste, shifting diets, many of the actions we've heard about already today. But then also, because within the land sector, we sequester carbon as well, we need to do things like increasing carbon sequestration from improved management of forests, improved management of soils and pasture lands. And so this is where we can really directly connect the nature and climate agendas together. If we take a step back and look at the surface of the Earth, about 63% of the livable surface are those working lands that I just described. And so if you take away ice and deserts and high mountains, 63% of what's left are working lands. So that's pasture land, farmland, and working forest. And that's a huge percentage of the Earth. So we often focus for the nature agenda on protected areas, and those are absolutely critical for so many reasons. But if we want to achieve our global climate and nature goals, we need that 63%, those working lands, to deliver food, fiber, and fuel, and also be part of the nature climate solution. So the FLAG project will incentivize the management of those lands to be aligned with climate targets, and the land and biodiversity targets we're developing within the Science-Based Targets Network that Erin is leading will also align those working lands with the nature agenda. So that's the critical connection between this work.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for making that connection. And Erin, let me come to you. So let's tie this back to the Earth Commission. How do science-based targets relate to Earth Commission, the work that Joyita and Johan are doing?
Yeah. Well, as you heard earlier from both Joyita and Johan, they're working on defining the safe and just, environmentally safe and socially just corridor for humanity. The guardrails that come out of that work are part of the scientific underpinning for the work that we do then in the network of translating that science into what it means for a company or a city to make sure that their target incents enough of the right action in the right places at the right time to ladder up to meeting that, staying within that guardrail that the Earth Commission's defined.
Fantastic. Thank you. Mm-hmm. So now that we're hearing so many calling for these integrated SBTs across so many of these different initiatives, Luis, let me ask you, what's it going to take? Are we going to be able to see these integrated SBTs come into fruition?
Thank you, Sweta. I think that's exactly the direction of travel, right? If we look down the road, we need to start to move towards that direction. Obviously, we need to take steps at a time because, as mentioned, those things, although interlinked, sometimes it's very hard to measure them and get them into the right place. But I wanted to just end with a quick message on how I believe that the work that SBTI does on climate actually helps the nature agenda as well. And I think there are two folds in how those things interact. Well, first, I think it was discussed a little bit that in order for nature-based solutions to really take off, we need quality assurance of supply, right? And there are so many institutions that are doing that, trying to ensure that projects or investments in nature-based solutions actually meet the quality assurance. How we support that agenda is that we are doing the quality assurance of the demand side of that equation, right? As companies are setting science-based targets for climate, they have some work to, and we encourage them to do some work beyond the supply chains as well. And we're soon going to be developing more specific standards for beyond supply chain mitigation strategies. but they have to be reducing their emissions, and that it actually is doing two things. Once they're setting science-based targets for climate. One is that it's guaranteed the integrity of the demand, which means that those companies that are demanding nature-based solutions actually also have something on climate. So if they're going for nature-based solutions, they're also reducing their emissions. So there's integrity of the demand there. And the second thing is actually creates demand for nature-based solutions. As companies said, there's science-based targets for climate, and they look on different ways to go beyond just their value chain. That's actually creating more demand for this nature-based solutions. And that's when those two agendas really start to merge together. But we cannot just treat them independently. Again, we need to reduce climate emissions and therefore go for nature to tackle some of the emissions that happen beyond your value chains.
Thank you, Luis. Erin, you have some thoughts you would like to share on this topic?
Yep. Well, while climate is out ahead, I'm excited to share that we are starting to play catch up. We have our first freshwater methods coming out later this year, and we're pushing toward our first science-based targets for nature in early 2023. And so that will be the first step forward in terms of integrated science-based targets. And then I think in terms of what it's going to take getting real in places, because when you're talking about wedding the climate agenda with the nature agenda, you have to the nature agenda is very place-based. It matters where you are. And so if you're looking only at a climate target, it might incent the planting of thirsty eucalyptus monoculture in the tropics, which is exactly not what you need for the long-term solution. And so if you tackle that in an integrated manner, you're going to be planting the right trees in that place so that you've got benefits not only for climate, but also for biodiversity and fresh water and the other aspects of the environment.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Erin, Luis, and Martha, for the work that you're doing to really integrate the different science-based targets and to scale them. It looks like this really will become reality, and climate and nature need to be talked about in the same breath. So thank you to each of you for what you are doing and for contributing your expertise to this segment.